That slide that we left off on, we have a few things left to talk about. So you guys have already read fairly extensively about evolution, natural selection, about sort of the history of life on Earth. So kind of just reviewing some of this from your reading. Going over some highlights. And so up to this point, we've talked about sort of natural selection, what it is, how it works, how it results in species changing over a period of time. Today we're going to talk about a couple things. Some more modern additions to what we know about evolution and natural selection, and a little bit about how life on Earth has evolved and changed over the history of the Earth. So when Darwin was formulating his ideas about natural selection, he didn't know about genetics at all. So, Mendel was working in around the same time period. Remember Gregor Mendel, who gave us our ideas about inheritance. DNA was not discovered until the 20th century. So Darwin didn't know. He knew that there was variation within a species, that the members of a population were not all identical. They were different from each other. But he didn't know the underlying reasons why. And so part of what we've learned since then, we call this the modern synthesis of evolution, sort of combining what we know about evolution with what we know about genetics into one sort of common theory. And so we know today, within a species, individuals have their own unique variations and differences because of a couple important things. Okay. First off, mutations. We just talked about this. A mutation is just kind of a random change to the genes, to the DNA of an individual. Cells constantly are being replicated, copied. And cells are a type of cell division called meiosis. Takes normal body cells and produces gametes, sperm and egg cells in animals. In this process of copying DNA and splitting it appropriately into multiple cells, sometimes there are mistakes that happen. We call those mistakes mutations. Okay? We'll talk a lot about DNA and the genetic code and so forth, but our DNA is basically a string of letters. Just 4 letters make up our DNA. Okay? G, A, T, and C. Okay, they're nucleotides. Guanine, cytosine, thymine, and adenine. And the sequence of those letters basically makes our DNA, makes us who we are. Each of us have a unique pattern. Okay? And when one of your cells makes a copy of itself, all of those letters need to be copied into the new cell. When a body cell produces a sex cell, half of the DNA goes to the sex cells. Okay? But along the way, there are sometimes mistakes. Sometimes one of those bases, one of those letters, gets changed from a T to an A, from a G to a T. But it gets changed sometimes. Sometimes a new base gets inserted in. Okay? Sometimes a base gets removed. Okay? So there's a variety of types of mutations. But they all change the DNA, and therefore they can have a result in the functioning and the way that the organism, those genes, are expressed. Now sometimes a mutation happens and it makes no real change. Sometimes a mutation happens, it may have a change that is negative for the survival of that individual. Sometimes a mutation may happen and it may result in a positive change for that individual. We watched that video about the mice, right, in the Southwest. And they traced back. They said, okay, well, there were lighter colored mice living in the desert. There was the lava flow. And then at some point, a mouse was born with darker fur. And the reason for that, and they traced it back through DNA analysis, was a change in the gene that codes for the fur color. and a mouse happened to be born with a mutation that made its fur darker. Now in that situation, that was an advantage for those mice because they lived near those lava flows, and it helped it blend in better. So in that case, it was a positive mutation. And then that mice was able to survive better, had a slightly higher chance of survival, and then reproduction and so forth. And that leads to, over time, changes in the species. So mutations are important. Now an important thing to know is that mutations can happen in all cells. But the only way a mutation can be passed on to the next generation is if that mutation happens in a sex cell. In animals, a sperm or egg cell. Okay? If it happens in a gamete. Because if there's a mutation that happens in the skin cell of a polar bear, well, that skin cell has no bearing on the next generation. Because the only thing that that polar bear passes on to its offspring are the genes contained within the sex cells, within a sperm or egg cell. So a mutation in the sperm or egg cell can be passed on to the next generation. Sometimes mutations can be caused by other factors, things like radiation, okay? Certain chemicals we call mutagens. They can increase the chance of mutations in certain cases. You know, radiation, for example, ultraviolet radiation in the sun's rays, okay, can lead to changes in the DNA that can lead to skin cancer. So that's an example of one of those. The other source of variation we know now is sexual reproduction. And sexual reproduction, as you know, results in much more variation than asexual reproduction. Because when organisms reproduce sexually, there's a combining of genetic information from two different parents to form the offspring. And so those offspring have new combinations of traits. Sort of like shuffling the deck. Okay? If you had two decks of cards, you shuffle them both, you take half the cards from one deck, half the cards randomly from the other deck and put them together, you end up with a new combination of cards in that final deck, different from both of the originals. Okay, there's randomness of which sperm cell fertilizes which egg cell, how the chromosomes align themselves. And also, as part of producing sperm and egg cells, there's this process that can happen called crossing over. And crossing over happens during the production of gametes, sperm or egg cells or pollen grains. During this process called meiosis, the chromosomes line up next to each other in pairs. They're called tetrads. And when they are lined up next to each other, these chromosomes sometimes swap pieces. So a piece from one chromosome is transferred to the other chromosome. And that adds variation as well, because now we have on this chromosome a different combination of genetic traits. So that leads to variation. So that's one of the modern additions to what we know about evolution, is that where do these variations come from? Sexual reproduction and mutations. We also know some more details about genetic processes that can lead to a change in a species. One is called genetic drift. And genetic drift is just sort of a random change in the genes of a population. So change isn't necessarily have adaptive value, but because of sexual reproduction and the mixing of traits and the way our genes are replicated, you can think about if you had like a jar of marbles of various colors. If you just randomly were to reach into this first jar of marbles, okay, and place them into the second jar, okay, you may have just randomly ended up with more blue marbles or more red marbles. You may not have been choosing to get more blue marbles, but you just happened to grab them when you reached in. And if those marbles reproduce, if you reach into this jar again, now you're again more likely to get a higher percentage of blue marbles. And if you repeat this process over time, you end up with, just sort of due to random chance, the population changing. It's not so much because one type of color was an advantage, it just randomly happened that in this initial stage you happen to get more of the blue ones. There's also this idea, yeah, Caleb?
So if they started in the first one and they got mostly red, then it would probably be
Yeah, and again, if they had randomly chosen and happened to get mostly red, well then this population over time might change to fully red. But again, it's just sort of random. It's just genetic drift, we call that. Another important thing is this idea called the founder effect. Founder effect happens when either a small number of individuals from one population move to another location, or there is a bottleneck, sort of a die-off of most members of a population, and you're left with only a few surviving members who then repopulate the species. Well, when you have that bottleneck, okay, there's a loss of genetic variation. If 90% of the individuals die off, there's only 10% left. And so there's a lack of genetic variability, most likely, in those remaining organisms. If you imagine, again, a jar of marbles, various colors. You have a large population, just random colors, so equal distribution. But then there's a bottleneck. If you just remove a few of these, okay, there's a drastic reduction in the population. Well, those surviving members then repopulate that population, but there's going to be less variability in the resulting population because you only started with a select few of that original population. It's called the founder effect. It's one of the things that people get concerned of with endangered species, that if we have only, several dozen Asiatic elephants or something surviving, well, there's not going to be a whole lot of genetic variability. If we're able to then allow for the repopulation from that smaller sample, the resulting population is not going to have a whole lot of variation, and therefore is less likely to survive changing climate, disease, things like that. When we think about how species have evolved on Earth, there's some patterns that scientists have identified and debated. And Darwin started with this idea of this branching theory of evolution, that the organisms we see today on Earth have evolved from previous species. Some species have been present and unchanged for tens of millions of years. Okay? And they exist in basically the same form today that they did 150 million years ago. Other species have become extinct and no longer survive. Some groups have branched off, where you had one group that gave rise to multiple branches, multiple types of species. And we know if we trace back species, we will find that they share common ancestors, sometimes in the recent past, sometimes in the far distant past, depending on the species. So if we look at sort of an idea about this tree of life, this is a pretty neat diagram. If you look it up online, you can see, but it shows a lot of the relationships between various types of living species. And we're going to talk a little bit about this, but if you have the origin of life, and then you have the fungi, and you have the plants, and you have the various types of invertebrates, and then arthropods, and up towards the top, vertebrates. And you see some of these branches don't die out. Many of these species are no longer on the Earth today, whereas others can survive well into modern times. And if we look at closely related species and trace them back, we could find common ancestors. Another concept is adaptive radiation. And this is when you have one individual, one group that adapts due to the situations where it migrates into many species. And an example that Darwin saw of adaptive radiation was the finches, the Galapagos finches. The Galapagos finches are thought to have all evolved from one common ancestor, a basic seed-eating groundfinch, that made its way to the Galapagos Islands and colonized the various islands over a period of time. And as these sort of ancestral finches reached those islands, they started to take different evolutionary paths. There were different selective pressures on various islands, different food sources. And so that led to each of the types of finches sort of starting to become more specifically adapted to a certain food source. And we know today we have all these various types of finches, okay, that have adapted to different conditions. You know, these finches adapted to eating insects on their islands. And their beaks have adapted through natural selection to match exactly the types of insects and poking around for different types of insects, looking in trees for insects. Some moved to islands that ate mainly seeds. And again, their beaks evolved through natural selection to be large and to crack large seeds to get at the seed within it, or smaller ones. Some evolved to eat cactus, some to eat fruits. So that's adaptive range. You start with the one species that branched out into all these species. When you look at these finches, they have a lot of similarities that tells us they shared a common ancestor, but then we have those differences which are due to their different evolution. And even behaviors. So behaviors are evolved as well. Behavioral evolution tells us that certain instinctive, certain behaviors are selected for and others can be selected against. And natural selection can work on behavior as well as physical structures. Things like mating behavior, right, is a result usually of sexual selection and choosing mates based on certain structures, certain characteristics, certain mating behaviors. Herding and schooling behavior in animals and schooling in fish. Those are behavioral adaptations, okay? And that herding behavior is beneficial to the survival of the species. How is it beneficial? You have like deer or gazelles, a herd of animals.
You don't have to outrun the lion, you just have to outrun your the deer friends.
Exactly. So when there is selective pressure from predators, herding behavior, schooling behavior in fish is best because as a group you can confuse a predator. A predator has to choose just one individual that they're going to try to hunt, and the majority of the herd is safe from that predator. So even though one has been sacrificed, it's better for the greater good of the species.
What happened to No Man Left Behind?
What's that?
What happened to No Man Left Behind?
It doesn't work in the animal kingdom. Yeah.
Yeah, that's too bad.
Speciation is another term. So speciation is a term we use for the development of new species. And we know we have millions of species on Earth today that have evolved from previous species through speciation. The way that new species are created often can start with a barrier. A geographic barrier can split a population into multiple subpopulations. Each of those populations starts evolving differently, adapting to different conditions until they become so different from each other that they're no longer the same species. They're no longer able to interbreed. You know, for example, if we're thinking about geologic time, huge changes, mountain ranges can form, rivers can form. So if you have a population of rabbits that gets split into two separate populations due to a river forming, okay, there's geographic isolation. These rabbits can no longer interbreed with each other. They can no longer mix their genes because there's a barrier. They each take a different evolutionary path. On one side, maybe it's beneficial to be light in color. One, it's beneficial to be dark in color. And over a period of time, they become so different from each other that they're no longer the same species. That if they encounter each other, if this river were to dry up and these species were to be able to meet each other again, they would no longer reproduce together. Okay? And because they become so different. Right? I don't know if this is probably based on some kind of example, but I don't know the exact details of the picture. the rate of evolution. How quickly do things evolve? Well, there's different ideas about this. So first off, species that reproduce very quickly, that have a very short reproductive cycle, have fast generations, can evolve more quickly because they're reproducing more quickly. Things like bacteria can adapt very quickly. Insects, because they go through a generation in a matter of hours or days. And so they can, selection can work very quickly in these species. Okay? There's also these competing ideas about how does evolution happen? Gradualism says that species just slowly change at basically a constant rate over time. Then there's a competing idea about punctuated equilibrium, in which species stay basically fixed for a long time, then there's some change in climate, some other selective pressure, and then you have the sudden diverging of species and evolving multiple species, which then stay constant over a period of time. If we look at, this would be an idea about some changes in some moths, and this would be the idea of gradualism. Gradually, one species split, changed, and slowly over time became two different species. Versus this idea of punctuated equilibrium, where we have one species stays basically constant, then there's a sudden change, and then it stays constant for a long time. So just different ideas about how quickly evolution takes place. Convergent evolution is interesting. Convergent evolution means that different species can evolve to have similar traits, similar characteristics, because they live under similar conditions. Again, we talked about this, a shark, a dolphin, a penguin, all very different species, did not evolve from a common ancestor in the recent past. They're all quite different. But when we look at them, okay, they all have a fair number of similarities. Look at body shape, look at the structure of their limbs. They all look similar because they all adapted to life in the water. And that leads to certain body shapes and so forth. So they all sort of took a similar evolutionary path to adapt to life in the water, even though they came from different ancestors. Coevolution. This is interesting when two species have evolved sort of together, okay, in response to each other. And a good example of this is hummingbirds. Hummingbirds' bill length and the length of the shape of the flowers they feed on are sort of perfectly matched with each other. Okay? That they have evolved over a period of time so that the hummingbird's bill is the perfect length and shape to reach into the flower to get nectar. And they're both have evolved together. It's called coevolution. Okay? You can see this bird has evolved this strange curved beak. It feeds only on this specific type of flower, which has this exact same shape, so its beak can fit in around the curve and feed on nectar from deep in the flower. So they've evolved sort of together. Another idea is selective breeding, or it's sometimes called artificial selection. This is when so rather than natural selection, when nature selects which individuals survive and which do not, this is when humans make that decision. Humans select which individuals survive, which individuals reproduce. And this is where all of our agricultural crops and agricultural animals have come from. They have been selectively bred by humans. All, a cow, a pig, a chicken, corn, wheat, tomatoes, apples, all of those agricultural products have an ancestor, a wild ancestor, that humans took and recognized certain properties and then selectively bred over a period of time to produce the things we call our foods today. An example, wild mustard is a native wild plant. Doesn't look like much, but all of these vegetables have been bred selectively bred over thousands of years from wild mustard. Things like broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, kale, kohlrabi. They all are selectively bred from this mustard plant. And they come in different ways. They have been bred in different ways. Small changes to the genes, like broccoli. The plant has the delayed development of flowers, and therefore the flowers on these stems do not develop, and that's what leads to little pieces of broccoli. Okay, the leaves in this species in kale, the leaves of this wild mustard have been selectively bred for the largest leaves, so that we have that. So they all came from the same basic wild plant. Dogs or cows or chickens also were bred from wild ancestors. All modern breeds evolved from a wolf-like ancestor. And did we watch Cosmos? Okay.
That was a good show.
So hopefully, maybe I can show you that. But anyway, all of these breeds, basically humans took, when wolves are wild population, but humans would feed sort of the most, sometimes there would be wolves born that had lower levels of hormones that made them aggressive. And they're less likely to be scared off by humans, less aggressive, and so humans would sometimes feed them. And over time, those wolves, humans would select the tamest of those wolf-like ancestors, the most helpful, the ones that were not ferocious. And over time, they became more and more tame, more and more domesticated, until we had dogs. And then our modern breeds are bred from those dogs. When you take the tiniest of each litter and you allow them to breed together, and you do that for hundreds and hundreds of generations, you end up with these tiny little, miniature poodles and stuff. Okay? But they all came from the same ancestor, and that's due to selective breeding. And finally, so let's talk about sort of the history of life on Earth. So if we go back, okay, to the very beginning, the Earth is 4.5 or so billion years old. And so where did all of these living organisms come from? Well, the question always was, well, how does that start? How does the evolution of life start? And you need to start with organic molecules. Okay, generally, organic molecules do not form on their own. They're generally formed by living things. Okay? Today, we don't see that atoms do not form organic molecules on their own. They don't just spontaneously, a bunch of elements combine to form an organic molecule. Okay? So where do they come from? To have life, you have to start with these organic molecules. Well, some scientists felt that based on what we think the early atmosphere of the Earth was, that there are ways that you can get these organic molecules from natural processes. And Miller and Urey did the most famous experiment to look at this. Miller and Urey, they had a mix of gases that they thought was what the gases in our primitive atmosphere were. Okay? The atmosphere was much different at the origin of life than it is today. And they had water that they put together, the various elements that were present in that early Earth. And then they had electrodes, which simulated lightning strikes, because you need energy for this to happen. And when they did this, okay, when they went through this experiment, what they found is that in the liquid that was formed, they found amino acids, organic molecules that are needed for living things to form. There's 20 different amino acids that are necessary, and those were all found in those liquids that are produced by this experiment. So that was one of the first experiments that showed it's possible to get organic molecules from these not inorganic starting points. When you have electricity, you have those conditions. Okay? And you need energy along the way to cause these things to form. So you have first simple molecules of carbon and water form when energy is added, and then over time these molecules become more and more complex, okay, until we end up forming the basics of DNA. So the first life on Earth has been identified as sort of bacteria-like life from about 3.5 billion years ago. So where did these first living cells arise from? Well, there was no oxygen in the Earth's early atmosphere. Okay, there was no oxygen. So these original bacteria-like organisms relied on anaerobic respiration, respiration without oxygen. This is called the heterotroph hypothesis. Okay? And then over time, these bacteria developed photosynthesis. Photosynthetic bacteria appeared about 2.2 billion years ago. And after the formation of photosynthetic bacteria, then oxygen begins accumulating in the Earth's atmosphere, because that's a byproduct of photosynthesis. Okay? Over time, after oxygen accumulates in the atmosphere, then aerobic bacteria can evolve that use that oxygen to release energy. So eventually, these were all prokaryotic cells, cells without a nucleus, cells without membrane-bound organelles. But then scientists believe that somehow these prokaryotic organisms formed sort of a symbiotic relationship with other prokaryotic organisms. Okay? And this is called the endosymbiotic theory, and that you have the ancestral cells. At some point, the cell membrane started folding in on itself to form things like the ER. Okay? A membrane started to form around the DNA. At one point, heterotrophic bacteria were engulfed by these cells, and they became mitochondria. Mitochondria in our cells have separate DNA from our own nuclear DNA. And scientists believe that these mitochondria evolved from prokaryotic cells that were engulfed by these ancestral cells. At the same time, chloroplasts are thought to have evolved in a similar way. If you have an autotrophic bacteria that was engulfed by a cell, they are what became the chloroplast. And eventually, these photosynthetic eukaryotes now became plants, and the heterotrophic eukaryotes became animals in the other kingdoms. Over time, sexual reproduction evolved for the combining of genes to form offspring. Cells, organisms started becoming multicellular. They went from single-celled only to forming colonies of cells to eventually multicellular organisms. Invertebrate animals evolved. Okay? Things like sponges, very simple animals, into more complex animals, worms, jellyfish, mollusks. Eventually, plants evolved and moved onto land, going from simple bryophytes, okay, eventually into more complex tracheophytes. Animals moved onto land. Okay, they started in the water as jawless fish, then into jawed fish, which are the vertebrates. Some of these fish evolved to move onto land, becoming amphibians. Some of these amphibians adapted and became reptiles. Reptiles diverged into birds and mammals, and flowering plants evolved along the way. If we look at all of those things, we look at this sort of geologic time scale, you can see sort of that progression and how these different types of things evolve.
Can you put the stuff that we need to know for the test online?
Yeah. All right. I will.